You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Dailey and Kevin Laramée.
Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. Mark Dailey here on what started out to be a very sort of kind of slow news week in F1, but with the World Cup up and running and right in the thick of the action in Russia at the moment, it's kind of not really too much of a surprise that things have been a little bit quiet, but it sure has picked up as the week has gone on, and that's part of the reason why I delayed it, and also because I've been out watching the World Cup as well. And just on a side note, can we just put to rest now the whole question of whether or not Cristiano Ronaldo is the GOAT, the greatest of all time? Just based on what we've seen over the past week or so at the World Cup, I mean, the guy is absolutely amazing. And I'm not even a Real Madrid or a Ronaldo fan, but I guess I probably am now after being so impressed watching him over the past week or so. But anyways, we're not here to talk about soccer. We're here to talk about Formula One. And after a couple of weeks break, we are back and in action this weekend at the French Grand Prix, the first French Grand Prix in a decade, which just absolutely amazes me. I can't believe that the country where Formula One basically started has been off of the circuit, off the Formula One calendar for so long. And the last driver to actually win the race, the French Grand Prix, was Kimi Räikkönen. Sorry, no, it was Felipe Massa who won in 2008. Kimi Räikkönen won in 2007. Both Ferrari drivers, and well, basically since the beginning of this century, it's been all Ferrari at the French Grand Prix, but it won't be at Manicourt this year. It will be at Paul Ricard. And well, we'll get to that in a little bit later on in the program. I just mentioned right off of the top here about Kimi Räikkönen being one of the most recent winners of the French Grand Prix, and Räikkönen, who will be turning 39 later this year, which makes him a grand old gentleman in the sport of Formula One. But in reality, in real life, 39 is not very old at all, of course. Has been on a one-year contract extension with Ferrari, seems for like the past several years at any rate, but Kimi not really getting it done. It seems that if you look some of the other pairings in Formula One, obviously the Mercedes tandem of Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas seem to be the most solid pair of drivers being able to maximize points. Red Bull obviously have a very good partnership with Max Verstappen, or a lineup, I should say. Partnership would imply more teamwork between the two of them, and that isn't necessarily always the case, but Max not really pulling his weight, so we've been over those issues that young Verstappen has been having so far. But Räikkönen, you would think a guy that has all the experience that he has and a world championship under his belt as well would be able to deliver a little bit more, and I think that sadly, Kimi is just getting a little bit long in the tooth because the rumor that's been going around this week is that Charles Leclerc, the Sauber driver, and of course he's a Ferrari contracted driver, will be replacing Räikkönen at the Scuderia in 2019, which is a bit of a mind blower when you think about it, because Ferrari typically never, or well, typically never, I shouldn't say typically, they never have given a shot to a young driver, especially somebody as young as Charles Leclerc, who I believe is 20 years old. It's amazing to think that might be the case. I mean, Kimi, I'm being a little bit hard on him. He did have a fairly strong start to the year. He had 3 podiums in the first 4 races, and he was actually a little bit closer to Sebastian Vettel than he has been in the previous couple of seasons. But he hasn't been on the podium in a couple of races, and I really expected more from Kimi, especially in Canada a couple of weeks ago. When you look at the way that Sebastian Vettel literally just raced raced off in the distance around Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. Obviously, the Ferrari was the car that was the best one, that was running best around the track there at the Canadian Grand Prix, and Kimi just wasn't able to match his teammates' speed, and honestly, he was a bit of a non-factor in that one. So is it a little bit too early, a little bit too premature to suggest or even speculate that Kimi might be getting replaced by somebody? Well, I know Kevin and I have talked about it off and on over the years, and and this is the third season we've been covering Formula One on this podcast. So yeah, I'm going to go back to 2016, 2017. We've had this conversation several times in the past, and I would have to say that I'd hate to see Kimi Räikkönen leave Formula One, but got to go sometime. And what Charles Leclerc has done through the first half dozen 7 races of the season has been nothing short of absolutely remarkable. I mean, I know he's a young guy and 7 races doesn't make or break a Formula One career, but what he's done compared to his teammate Marcus Ericsson in the other Sauber is it's night and day. Leclerc has really been able to take that car by the scruff of the neck and really do very well with it, scoring some points, having some very good outings in qualifying. So, the car is going to take you so far, and guys that have what it takes, that have that natural talent, they can just get a little bit more out of the car, get more out of the car than other people can. So, Michael Schumacher was a guy like that, and of course, Michael has 7 world titles to his name. I mean, it's a little bit early, obviously, to be comparing Charles Leclerc with the great Michael Schumacher, but who knows? Maybe just comparing them on a talent scale or a driving ability scale, maybe Charles Leclerc is that Schumacher-esque type driver that can just take a car by the scruff of the neck and wring out every ounce of performance that he needs from it. All right, well, I'm going to be kind of jumping around from different news items here and there. There are lots of news items where I've been sitting down and making my notes over the past couple of days. I've kind of been thinking, well, this is pretty important, and that's a big deal too, but I can't really forget about this. But when I think about it, it's just, how do I prioritize all of this? Unless I do this each and every day of the week, maybe a 10 or 15 minute podcast, maybe then I'd be able to talk about the big news of the day, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Sometimes there isn't very much news, especially when you get between Grand Prix weekends, especially when you're sort of like midway between one race and the next. News can be a little bit thin, but I'm going to dial it back. If you will excuse me, I'm going to go all the way back to last week because I really think we should talk a little bit about Fernando Alonso and winning or being part of the team that won the Le Mans 24-hour race last week. Of course, Fernando is been quite open, saying that he wants to win motorsport's Triple Crown, which is the Monaco Grand Prix, which he's won twice, the Indianapolis 500, and Le Mans. Well, Fernando, he's got 2 out of the 3 victories that he needs in that one, and only needs to win Indy 500 to become only the 2nd driver in the history of motorsport to win the Triple Crown. And the only other guy that's ever pulled it off is Graham Hill. Yes, that's right. Damon Hill, himself a Formula One world champion and pundit on Sky Sports Formula One coverage. That was his dad, of course. And it just, it's incredible when you think how many guys that have had a crack of it and how many guys that have won 2 out of the 3, but just haven't been able to get to the third one. I believe Jacques Villeneuve has won both Monaco and Indianapolis, but never won Le Mans. I think won Pablo Montoya, a guy that races in IndyCar as well, or sorry, in NASCAR. Actually, where's Montoya? I've kind of lost track of him a little bit. Of course, raced in Formula One and won the Indy 500 as well. So, yeah. Fernando Alonso, very impressive. But the thing that makes it more impressive is just how far behind the number 8 Toyota was at one point in the race. I believe that they were 2 minutes or so, more or less, behind the sister car, the number 7 Toyota. And it really came, the real big chunk of that happened when Alonso's teammate, Sebastian Buemi, who was also a former Formula One driver, was handed a 60-second stop-go penalty for speeding in one of these yellow zones, which is kind of a cool thing. And maybe we can talk about this one day, but a yellow zone at Le Mans in endurance racing is like a virtual safety car, but it wasn't for the entire track. Of course, Circuit de la Sarthe is fairly long, probably a lot longer than a lot of Formula One tracks, maybe than other than Spa. I think that Fernando at his peak was lapping in about 3-minute 20s, low 3-minute 20s. I think maybe even got down to about 3-minute 19 seconds for a lap. So yeah, pretty long circuit, but I like that idea. I like the idea of the concept of a virtual safety car in Formula One, and I like the idea of these yellow zones where you only have a virtual safety car over a portion of the track. But we'll talk about that another time. But just absolutely incredible. I mean, Sebastian Buemi, he got that 60-second stop-go penalty, and it's even more costly when you think about how long or slow the drive in and out of the pits at Le Mans is. So they were really, really, really in a big hole. But when Alonso was out there, he was over 2 minutes behind the sister car, and his pace was just absolutely lightning quick. Later on in the race, the number 7 car had a whole bunch of penalties and also had a bunch of problems. So they finished in quite a comfortable gap out front. But the thing was, when Alonso was out there in the middle of the night, I think he started his final stint, or that night stint, at about 1:30 in the morning, and he was lapping anywhere between 3 and 5 seconds quicker per lap than the other Toyota. Absolutely amazing. And it's a great accomplishment. I didn't really follow up on it too much, but I do believe that Alonso said that his victory, or the team's victory at the Le Mans this past weekend, was the most historic and the best one ever in the history of the sport, or maybe not in the sport, but at least at Le Mans itself, maybe not in endurance racing. And sure, I mean, if you can pull that off, you've got the right to brag. How that really fits into a place that has the history of Le Mans. Well, maybe those of you that follow endurance racing closer than I do are in a better position to make that judgment call, but certainly it has to rate up there. And when you think now that Alonso has won Le Mans, he's won Monaco twice, as I've said, that you have to think that he's going to have another crack at the Indy 500. And of course, Fernando did come out and say after Le Mans that he is giving Indianapolis the highest priority for next year. And I really kind of wonder if Fernando's going to be back in Formula One. I've been putting that out there for the past little while. A lot of the things that he's been saying, a lot of the body language, a lot of, if you want to call it that, just reading between the lines really makes me wonder if this is Fernando's swan song in Formula One. Of course, his legacy in Formula One, it's complicated. Let's be honest. I mean, here's a guy that broke into the sport. He was fairly young. I mean, he started with Minardi of all teams. I mean, I remember seeing him race at the European Grand Prix at Nürburgring back in 2001, I'm guessing. I think that was his first year, and he was just this young, fresh-faced kid, and I mean, he didn't really impress too much at that time. I mean, he was like the newcomer on the block. Of course, he really got on people's radars pretty quickly, and of course won 2 world titles with Renault. I was going to say Benetton, but 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Almost the same thing, right? Or not. Anyways, and then of course after he left Renault, he went to McLaren, went to Ferrari, back to McLaren, and it's complicated. And I think when you look at Fernando now in his career, obviously it's winding down in Formula One. If things had gone properly, don't you get that feeling that he might have been one of those guys that could have been maybe chasing some of the records in Formula One, or setting more of them than he did? I mean, I really think that 2 world championships in Formula One is a lot less, or maybe not really what we could have really seen. I really feel like if he had made some better decisions, if he hadn't been involved in some of this fighting in politics and all these situations. I mean, obviously, when he was partnered with Lewis Hamilton and McLaren, that didn't really go very bueno. I mean, let's be honest about it. And of course, who can resist the lure of Ferrari? I mean, Ferrari has still not really gotten back to where they were at the turn of the century when they were absolutely dominant. When they had a dream team. I mean, honestly, they did. They had Jean Todt as team principal, Ross Brawn designing the cars and in charge of all that. You had Michael Schumacher driving it. It's no wonder they won. What was it? 5 constructors championships, and Michael won 5 drivers championships when he was at Ferrari, and 7 in total. Yeah, he won 2 with Benetton. So, yeah, I mean, 5 at Ferrari, absolutely amazing. And I think they're chasing that. They've been chasing that ever since. And if you're a guy like Fernando Alonso, when you're at that peak in your career and it hadn't really worked out, McLaren and Ferrari come knocking, who could resist? I mean, there is a magical lure almost of racing those scarlet Ferraris and being the guy that can lead them back to glory. I mean, will we ever see another dynasty like we did during the Schumacher era? Well, who knows? But obviously that didn't work out with them, and he ended up going back to McLaren to go back, or when they were rejoined with Honda in 2015. Of course, that didn't really turn out very well, and they've sort of languished. And now this year they have the Renault engines, and honestly, they're not much better. So Fernando, obviously, you can see why he's decided to go and chase the Triple Crown, and you can see why he would be really motivated to go and go back to Indy as soon as possible. He's signed up for the super season in World Endurance Cars with Toyota, so he'll be doing a couple of the other races. He'll be doing, or several others, including 6 Hours of Silverstone, all the Formula One, some more endurance stuff, and then he'll be racing again at Le Mans this time next year in 2019. So it's going to be pretty busy for them. And obviously McLaren is still talking about or researching the possibility of fielding a team in IndyCar next year, whether or not Fernando would go and race for them or for someone else. I mean, he went there with Andretti Motorsport last year at Indy. I mean, he did a great job then. So I mean, he's got the skill to do it, and if he's there next year at Indy, if he's at the Brickyard, and I've got the choice to watch that live or watch Monaco. Of course, they're not going to be on at the same time. I mean, honestly, I would pick to watch Indy to see if Fernando could pull it off. Last year, it didn't quite work out, but you can tell that with the age that he's at and the options that he has, he'll have several goes at it, I'm sure, to wrap that one up and try and get the Triple Crown for himself. Anyways, moving right along, there's plenty more news, and we'll get to that after this quick break. All right, well, moving along to the next item of news, and this is another big one. I hinted at it sort of, kind of, but not really in the previous segments. And the long, sort of protracted, drawn-out drama, if you want to call it that, of the Red Bull engine decision. Don't you think is it just me, or is we're kind of likening it to LeBron and that decision that he made when he went to Miami all those years ago? Is that on the same scale? No, probably not. I think LeBron's decision to go to the Miami Heat several years ago was probably bigger, probably more dramatic, but still, in Formula One terms, it is a big deal. When you look at the partnership that Renault and Red Bull had for over a decade, about 12 years, they obviously won several world championships, several constructors championships, 57 Grand Prix. Just absolutely amazing. But Red Bull announced earlier this week that they have indeed decided to take on Honda engines and partner up with them for 2019 and 2020. Of course, 2021 is still all up in the air. What with the new regulations and the new rules and everything still up in the air and being decided upon. And I hope we get an update soon on what Formula One and the FIA is proposing for 2021. But at least we know for the next 2 years that Red Bull will have Honda power. And I think that's really, really I don't know. Do you think it's a surprise move? I kind of think that you could say you saw this one coming. I think that if they were eager to re-up with Renault, which has been a bit of a strained relationship, at least in this hybrid turbo era, ever since 2014, they've been the third best engine behind Mercedes and Ferrari, and they just haven't been good enough. I mean, they've still won, I believe, 10 Grand Prix in that time, which is nothing to turn your nose up against, but for a team that was the best team in Formula One for quite a while, and of course Formula One is cyclical, it has been obviously a very bitter pill for them to swallow, but having that unprecedented, I think, opportunity to be able to evaluate Renault power in their own cars and Honda power in the back of the Toro Rossos, which is their junior team, their sister team, really gave them the opportunity to really compare the data between the two engines one-on-one and really decide which is going to make a big difference. And what a difference a year makes. This time last year, there was just a whole debacle of the McLaren Honda partnership. I mean, McLaren were using every single opportunity to throw shade at Honda and just how much of a terrible job they were doing, how underpowered their engines were. And of course, last year they were. But McLaren kept on going on and saying that how wonderful their car was, and they had one of the best chassis in the entire Formula One series, all these sorts of things. And then this year they've got Honda or Renault power, and they're not really doing that much better. Toro Rosso is more than a match for them. And the thing is with the Renault engine, they're not even really anywhere close to the Renault Works team, which is still on that mid-term or mid-range project, if you want to call it that, rebuilding the team into a title contender, which I think they want to, they set a deadline or a goal, I think is probably more accurate, of about 2020 to get back to the top of Formula One. I mean, they have improved each and every year since they bought out Lotus at the end of 2014, I guess it was, and then have decided then rebadged it and started running their own works team. They have improved each and every year. I mean, the first year was obviously just a rebranded Lotus. Last year was their first go at having a works car in more than a decade, of course. And this year, obviously, they're a very solid middle of the pack kind of team. So they're well on their way to getting back to where they want to be. But just very interesting, though, that despite all of that, and despite that Renault and their engines are getting better each and every year, that Red Bull decided that they just weren't good enough. And I don't know, do you think that this taints the legacy that Red Bull and Renault have and what they've accomplished in Formula One? I don't think so. I mean, obviously, you can make the arguments that just the lack of success and how much they tailed off. I mean, Mercedes is a hard one to measure up against because they were ultra prepared for the hybrid turbo era. When you think about it, all the time, the money, the preparation that they put into it, they were miles ahead of everybody. And when they came onto the scene in 2014 and the way they just immediately dominated was absolutely incredible. And I mean, they have been the team to beat over the past several years, and not very many people have been able to do it. Of course, it's mainly been Ferrari, occasionally Red Bull, and nobody's really been able to get anywhere near Mercedes. So you can see that Red Bull is trying to get back where they belong, and Honda, they've got a big task in front of them. Obviously, we know that things didn't turn out very well with with McLaren, but Honda has said that for 2019, their goal is to keep Red Bull in the position that they're in at the very least. So where Red Bull is right now, third in the Constructors' Championships, they've won a couple of races this year. They've been a contender, and I think they've been a pleasant surprise this year. Honestly, they really have. Obviously, Ricciardo's won a couple of races, and poor old Verstappen, if he could get his head straight and focused and do what Max does best without driving up the side of somebody or putting his car off of the track, I think that where they're sitting at right now in the Constructors' Championship is a little bit, I wouldn't say it's sort of a false indicator, but it doesn't really, I think, indicate what the true potential of the team is, or what they could have done, or what they could be doing if both of their drivers had been delivering. So yeah, Honda's got to put up big shoes to fill, and they really got to get that done for next year. And this is also sort of very interesting, but Renault, but Aston Martin, I should say, Aston Martin, who is the title sponsor of Red Bull Racing, has said that there's no name clash with Honda and the switch that Red Bull have made to their engines, because you usually don't see two competing car manufacturers on the same car. Of course, they haven't had that issue over the past couple of years because the deal that Red Bull had with Renault was that they're able to rebrand and rebadge the engine, so they are in fact Tag Heuer, who of course make watches rather than Renault Power. So you didn't have Aston Martin and Renault logos both on the same side of the car. But when you think about it, I don't think that Aston Martin really minds too much, because the people that buy in Hondas aren't really the same kind of people, aren't really in the same tax bracket, earnings bracket, whatever you want to call it, as the people that are going out and buying Aston Martins. So I think that having both badges on the side of the Red Bull for next year, I think it's going to work out just fine. And in other news, I can afford a Honda, but the Aston Martin, yeah, still working on that one. I'll keep you up to date, but spoiler alert, it's not going to happen anytime soon. Just another interesting little bit, but Renault have had a couple of interesting things here and there to say over the past weeks. Cyril Abiteboul, the boss of Renault, said that they want to make Red Bull regret the decision that they've made, and fair enough. That's his prerogative and his right to say that. Of course, I don't think that if any one of us was in a similar position, you would say anything otherwise. Whether or not they can pull it off, that'll be remain to be seen. But it's interesting too. Abiteboul also said that he believes that it was fuel development that was putting Red Bull behind, because they are not using the same fuel and lubricants that Renault and McLaren, who use BP and Castrol fuel, and Red Bull has a deal with Exxon and Mobil. So he believes that they're not really getting the full potential out of the car that they could be if they're using the same fuel and lubricants as the Renault Works team. So moving along to other Renault. Last week it was all Renault, or Red Bull. This week it's all Renault, but it all starts with R's. Red Bull, Renault, Ricciardo. So I'm trying to get there eventually if I don't keep tripping up over myself. But now I do actually want to talk about Danny Ricciardo. I do want to talk about Renault. I do want to talk about Red Bull, because of course Ricciardo, who is honestly out there trying to market himself for 2019. He's out of contract at Red Bull at the end of the year. Of course, when you're a guy like Danny Ricciardo, who's proven he can win races in Formula One and not actually be on the front row of the grid, that the teams, the names that you're going to be linked with are going to be the obvious ones, and those would be Ferrari, and the other team, of course, would be Mercedes, both of whom have drivers that are out of contract for next year. The only guy that has a contract for 2019 and beyond at either of those teams is Sebastian Vettel. Valtteri Bottas only has he's on an option year at Mercedes. Lewis Hamilton is in his final year at Mercedes, and of course, you have to think that that deal is going to get done sooner rather than later, or maybe later rather than sooner. I mean, they've said that they are working on a deal. Lewis has said that there's no rush to get anything done. Toto Wolff, the team principal at Mercedes, has basically said the same thing. Valtteri Bottas, why wouldn't you bring him back for Mercedes for 2019? And Kimi Räikkönen at Ferrari, we've already talked about that. So potentially, maybe Bottas doesn't get re-signed for Mercedes. Obviously, Raikkonen, all signs are pointing to him not coming back, but could you see a really, really expensive pairing like Danny Ricciardo, that's a guy that's fairly young, still coming into the prime of his career, and four-time world champion Sebastian Vettel? That's a lot of money tied up into a couple of drivers, but still, if there's a team that has deep enough pockets to actually do that, it would be Ferrari. Whether or not they want to go down that route, well, that's a completely different question. But Ricciardo, he's saying all the right things. He had said that there is, quote unquote, some appeal potentially moving to a team like a McLaren or a Renault, and that's kind of been floating around there. I believe it was in the German media earlier this week, suggesting that he could possibly go to McLaren for next year. Or at least there's a rumor out there that they would at least like to try and sign him. I mean, I could see Ricciardo probably maybe sort of move to a team like Renault over a team like McLaren. I don't know what's going on there. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes, but there's no easy fix there. Let's be honest about it. They haven't really lived up to what they've been saying. I mean, they've been saying all the right things over the past couple of years, but they're still just not getting the performances that they need on the track. They're not getting the results that they really need, although they are doing better this year, obviously. I mean, they are scoring more points than they have in the past couple of years, but I think that for fans of Fernando Alonso, for fans of Stoffel van Dorn, for fans of McLaren, that it's just a little bit too much of a stretch to see them challenging for podiums and race wins, which of course is where they want to be right about now. So they still have a lot of work to do, but I couldn't see a guy like Danny Ricciardo going to McLaren at this point in time. That would be, to me, too much of a regression in his career, whereas to me, where McLaren is kind of almost stagnated and become stuck, if you want to put it that, Renault is very much a team moving in the opposite direction. They are moving up through the pack each and every year. They have the will to become a champion again, to be a contender again in Formula One. They have the means, the financial means to do it. So I could see a guy like Danny Ricciardo going there. And while I think that it was a good move for them to bring Nico Hülkenberg in to become, basically their number one guy for the past couple of years, was a good move at the time, I don't know if he's going to be the guy that's really going to take the team forward. I think in the interim, I think that he's a good, solid choice to do, to be that number one guy, but I don't think he's a game changer like Daniel Ricciardo. Whether or not Ricciardo would want to maybe take that risky kind of move and go to Renault when there are other potential options in front of him, you'd have to think that Red Bull itself would still have to be the front runner to re-sign him and keep that partnership with himself and Max Verstappen going for another couple of years. And of course, like we're saying, the lure of Ferrari, that might be too tough for Daniel Ricciardo to resist should they come knocking. And the same thing with Mercedes. I mean, Ferrari is probably the second best option to really take over and become I think they have the potential, let's put it that way, to become the next champion if anybody's going to snatch that title away from Mercedes. And of course, Mercedes themselves. I mean, they've proven over the past several years what an awesome team they are, what an awesome car that they have, what an awesome engine they have. And I think that if you were a driver in Formula One, if that opportunity came up, I think that you would get your name signed on the bottom of that deal as fast as you possibly could. Anyways, before we take another quick break here in a couple of minutes, just further news about Mercedes. They have delayed the deployment of their new specification engine. It could be delayed even further. There's no confirmation as yet whether or not it'll be used at the French Grand Prix. It was going to be run in Canada a couple of weeks ago, pardon me, but that was delayed after last-minute reliability problems. So it could be a scenario where they have old engines on Friday and then Saturday switch to the new spec, and then if not, they may deploy fresh examples of the old spec engine on Saturday, and then which in theory they'd have to do 7 race weekends. So very much up in the air what's going to happen with Mercedes this weekend at Circuit Paul Ricard. Anyways, more news on that and other news, including Martin Whitmarsh dissing his former team and McLaren not too happy about that. And we'll talk about that and more after this short break. Okay, and as I mentioned before the break, Martin Whitmarsh, the former McLaren boss, is back in the news after he suggested last weekend in the Mail on Sunday that he believes that McLaren needs to axe, which is a pretty blunt and a term that doesn't leave much interpretation left into it. They need to axe a bunch of senior personnel to revive its fortunes. McLaren, the team, dismissed his criticism, saying it was ill-judged and ill-informed after he made those comments. And Whitmarsh, of course, he worked for the team for 15 years before he was ousted, and he said that the team needs a big change of approach. And, well, we could talk about McLaren for ages and ages and ages. I mean, we could do a whole show on the problems that this historic and once powerhouse of a team has had in Formula One, but they haven't even had a podium now in almost 4 years, and that was at the Australian Grand Prix, and that was just before Martin Whitmarsh actually parted company with the team, but he'd already been removed as a principal at that point, and he even went on to say that he feels desperately sad about the situation that McLaren finds himself in at the moment, and he said that he wouldn't turn them away if they ever came back and asked him for support. But last week, we were talking about Lando Norris, and apparently Zach Brown has said that he has been approached by 3 teams other than or including Toro Rosso, which was the team that made the news last week, and approaching them about signing the current GP2 champion or points leader, Lando Norris, and Zach Brown put the kibosh on that, so he's not going to Toro Rosso. And I wonder who the other 2 teams are, and I've got my suspicions. I have the feeling that perhaps the 2 other teams that were looking to secure Lando Norris's services for the rest of this year and perhaps maybe next year and beyond. Why not Haas? Why not Williams? Williams, of course, their car, the FW41, is a total dog. It's a total lemon, and they have not had any results of note this year. They've just been absolutely horrible. Lance Stroll didn't finish the Canadian Grand Prix a couple of weeks ago, but that, of course, was more due to, completely due to the fact that he crashed into Brendan Hartley, that coming together with Hartley on the opening lap at Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. But Sergei Sirotkin, his teammate, first-year Formula One guy, he finished 2 laps down, so obviously not very good. And Stroll hasn't really had the opportunity to do much better. So I think that makes sense for a team that's looking for another driver. I think that Williams would be one of them. The other one, I think, obviously, or at least obvious to me, would be Haas. Romain Grosjean has had all sorts of problems this year. He's crashed a couple times on his own accord, and he's had so much bad luck. And I think that perhaps maybe an injection of some new blood in a team like Haas would be a good thing. Obviously, Roma has had his crack at the team there for a couple of years, and it just really isn't working out at the moment. But, changing a guy in the middle of a season is a very big and risky thing, and whether or not they want to do that, well, who knows? But Williams and Haas, that would be my guess as to one of those teams that could be perhaps chasing Lando Norris's services. And I'm going to jump around a little bit again, like I was saying at the top of the show. I just wanted, this made me laugh when I read this earlier this year. I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about Ferrari again here. And this was on motorsport.com. And the headline on that article reads, Montezemolo, Marchionni jealous of Ferrari's past glories. And of course, Luca Di Montezemolo is the ex-Ferrari president, and he says that he is, quote, sad his successor Sergio Marchionne is very jealous of the Italian Formula One team's former glories. And Di Montezemolo spent 23 years as the Ferrari president, and that came to an end not all that long ago in 2014. And that was a result of tensions that really couldn't last very long or much longer between himself and Sergio Marchionne, who is still the boss of Fiat Chrysler, which is the parent company of Ferrari. And last week, Di Montezemolo said at the new launch of the Michael Schumacher exhibition in Germany, he said that I'm sad to see that Marchionne is very jealous of the past. This is bad because to be jealous of the past, it means that you have something strange in the mind. So that was one quote that made me chuckle a little bit, although I'm sure once Marchionne himself heard that, I don't think he was laughing about that. But talking about Ferrari themselves, I thought this was also a very interesting claim, and this was made by Sebastian Vettel, who thinks that there is a way that Formula One drivers can game the system and actually make a gain under virtual safety cars. And this has actually been backed up by FIA race director Charlie Whiting. And he says that's actually true, that drivers can save time by using clever lines while they're behind a virtual safety car or while the virtual safety car is engaged. And he said that the potential gains are in fact very, very small, but the FIA will in fact act to close that loophole. And Vettel made these comments after the Spanish Grand Prix several weeks ago, saying it was possible for the drivers to beat the system by driving lines that cut distance that they wouldn't normally use under normal racing conditions. So Whiting actually agrees with that, and he said that they've gone and crunched the numbers. They've mathed the racing, if you want to call it that, and said that the potential gains are 150 milliseconds per lap. Okay. He says, but in Formula One, 150 milliseconds per lap is worth having, but that's the extent of it. As far as it was explained to me by our software people, we can rectify it and make it a bit more bulletproof. And another thing that may have to become a little bit more bulletproof, and this is something else that Charlie Whiting was talking about, was introducing an automated checkered flag system. And this comes in the wake of the Canadian Grand Prix when supermodel Winnie Harlow waved the flag a couple of laps too early. And that was due to the fact that, well, it wasn't her fault. She didn't decide to wave the flag early. She was instructed by one of the track officials at Circuit Gilles Villeneuve that the race was over and she should race or wave the checkered flag. And Sebastian Vettel wasn't too impressed. And in Montreal, you have to be careful because that is a track that's always packed. There's thousands and thousands of fans that swarm the track after the race to go and watch the podium ceremony. So you can understand there was a very serious and a very legitimate safety concern there, with people perhaps thinking that this would be the time that they got to get out of their seats and run across the track. But in fact, there's still cars out there doing 200 miles an hour, and they were going to be doing 200 miles an hour for a couple more laps. Anyways, it's not the first time that something like this has happened. It previously happened several years ago at the Chinese Grand Prix at the Brazilian Grand Prix, I think it was China, Brazil, one of those two races. Anyways, he actually waved the flag a little bit too late because he hadn't realized that the leader, I can't remember who won that year, crossed the finish line, and he'd been caught a little bit off guard. So Whiting has said that he will now consider having the official race end shown on the light boards above the start-finish line, which would override any issues with the checkered flag, which is kind of sad in a way, but I guess for safety and just to make it official, that's probably the way to go. Although the checkered flag itself, I think, would maybe it's just become too symbolic at this point in time. But definitely you don't want anything happening, like I say, with the potential for people to run out on the track and people getting hurt. Anyways, a little bit of happy news now for fans of Formula One's more iconic circuits, that the Belgian Grand Prix has signed a new 3-year deal with Formula One to keep the race at the legendary Spa circuit at least until 2021. So that's That's great news. They first hosted its first F1 race back in 1950, which was the first year of the Formula One World Championship. That deal, or their current deal, was set to expire this year, and I think it's a good indication that that Liberty Media, the current owners, the new owners of Formula One, I guess we can stop calling them the new owners of Formula One. They've been in charge now for what, year and a half? Anyways, they did say, and Chase Carey, the chairman, the big man over there at Liberty Media, said that although they are keen to find new places to go and race. Obviously, the new race in Miami, which looks to be going next year, maybe the year after at the very latest, is one. They're still talking about possibly a Vietnamese Grand Prix in Hanoi. They said while that those new markets are important, that they realize that the roots of the place where Formula One was born, of course, was in Europe. So it's equally as important to them to make sure that these tracks, these races like the German Grand Prix, the Belgian Grand Prix, hopefully the British Grand Prix, still remain intact and part of the circuit, the part of the series for years and years to come. So good news to see that that Spa will be back on the Formula One schedule for next year. All right. Well, it's time to start wrapping it up a little bit now. I wanted to just look a little bit quickly now at the French Grand Prix. Well, like I said earlier in the show, first French Grand Prix since the last one that was run at Magny-Cours in 2008. Felipe Massa won that one while driving for Ferrari. And it's been a very, very long time. So, like I say, that year it was a Ferrari 1-2, Massa first, Kimi Räikkönen second, Jarno Trulli third in the Toyota, Heikki Kovalainen in McLaren for fourth. Fifth was Robert Kubica in the BMW Sauber. And rounding out the top 10, then was Mark Webber in the Red Bull, Nelson Piquet Jr. and Fernando Alonso in the Renaults, David Coulthard in the Red Bull, and Lewis Hamilton rounding out the top 10 in the McLaren Mercedes. So this is actually the first French Grand Prix that we've seen at Paul Ricard since 1990. The last time that the French Grand Prix was held there, it was won by Alain Prost, and that's going back quite a ways. So that day, Alain Prost won the race there, 80 laps. He beat Ivan Capelli in the Leighton House Judd, which was a shocker at the time, considering that he finished ahead of Ayrton Senna, who was third in the McLaren, Nelson Piquet, Gerhard Berger, and Riccardo Patrese in the Williams Renault. Absolutely amazing to see some of those names there. And I mean, there's a lot of classic names there, but this has been Ferrari's event in all the years that they've had a French Grand Prix. Ferrari have won the French Grand Prix 17 times. And, well, that's 9 more times than the team that's won it the second most time, and that would be Williams. And I'd say it's pretty much a safe bet to say that they're not going to win this year, considering how horrible the car that they have. But there's nobody in the current class of drivers, if you want to call it that have won it more than once. The one guy that's won it the most, and this should not be any surprise, is Michael Schumacher, who won the French Grand Prix 8 times. Alain Prost won it himself 6 times. So great stuff to see. And this year, like I say, it is going to be at Circuit Paul Ricard, which is just outside of Marseille. It is a 5.842 length kilometer circuit. It's a total race distance of 309.6 kilometers. It looks to be a very tight and compact, very narrow circuit. And it's got a very long straightaway, 1.8 kilometers long, with a chicane now about 2/3 of the way along. It's a very grippy track with a fair amount of tire wear on it. Middle is sort of the pack, if you want to call it that, for downforce. So the tires that we're going to see this time, because there's more abrasion, are the soft, super soft, and ultra soft tires. And it's kind of interesting to look at the tire choices that most of the teams that have made. Not the real choice are the ultra softs for this weekend. Most of the teams have opted to load up on as many sets of the ultra softs as they could. Lewis Hamilton has chosen 2 pairs of soft, 3 pairs of super softs, and a whole bunch of ultra softs, compared to his teammate Valtteri Bottas, chosen 1 set of softs, 4 sets of super softs, and again, a whole lot of ultra soft tires. So who's to really say what this one is going to turn out like? We don't really know. We have no benchmark to really to look at to see who might do well and who might win this race. But I think it's been interesting. Of course, we've seen this year that all 3 of the top teams have won different races at different times. So is this going to be a track that is more suited to Ferrari? Is it going to be more suited to Mercedes? Is it going to be more suited to Red Bull? That's a very good question. The one big question that I have in my mind is whether or not the fact that Mercedes has had to delay the introduction of their latest specification engine. Maybe it'll come this weekend, maybe it won't. We really don't know. But that just makes me wonder if that will put them at a disadvantage to a certain degree at the French Grand Prix compared to Red Bull and Ferrari. But Ferrari definitely has looked strong the past couple of races. They looked pretty good in Monaco, or at least Vettel did, even though he wasn't able to really make a serious challenge to pass Danny Ricciardo to win that race. But, well, kind of Monaco, and it's difficult to get around there. Anyways, before we wrap it up, let's just quickly refresh our memories on the different the standings in the Constructors and the Drivers' Championship. Constructors is Mercedes at the top with 206 points, Ferrari in second with 189 points, Red Bull in third with 134 points, Renault in fourth with 56 points, McLaren with 40 points to round out the top 5. Now, just looking at the Drivers' Championship, it is Sebastian Vettel who is on top of the Drivers' Championship by a single point over Lewis Hamilton with 121. Lewis, of course, is miles ahead of his teammate Valtteri Bottas. Lewis with 120 points currently, Bottas with 86, Danny Ricciardo with 84, Kimi Räikkönen with 68, and Max Verstappen, the number 6 top driver in the World Championship at the moment, and he has 50 points. Well, I'm looking forward to watching this one, and I'm going to sign it off there, guys. I talked for a lot longer than I thought I would this week, and what with Kevin off covering the World Cup on Soccer Today here on SPN, he's pretty much wrapped up in that all day and all night, so I'm going to be flying solo here at least for the next couple of weeks until the World Cup finishes, so not having the opportunity to take too much of a break in between here to get a drink, to take a breath. I'm starting to run out of steam and my mouth is getting a little bit dry. So like I say, good place to stop here and just await the next Grand Prix. So that's it. Thank you all for downloading and listening to this show. Please do us a big favor and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, wherever you download and listen to this podcast. We would greatly appreciate it because it helps us grow the show and make it more visible. And we would really appreciate it if you could do us that small little favor. Anyways, if you want to get in touch with us, send us a tweet at Scuderia F1 Pod on Twitter or email us at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. That's it. That's a wrap. Enjoy the French Grand Prix this weekend, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.